The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop outside Bisbee, Arizona territory, throwing Rebecca Simmons against the wooden frame hard enough to bruise her shoulder. And she knew in that moment her carefully constructed plans were crumbling, just like everything else in her life. "End of the line, miss," the driver called down, his weathered face showing neither sympathy nor interest in her predicament. Rebecca gathered her worn carpetbag and stepped down onto the dusty street, her legs unsteady after 3 days of travel. The September sun beat down mercilessly on the copper mining town, and she could see the skeletal frames of mining operations dotting the surrounding hills. It was 1883, and Bisbee was barely more than a collection of hastily constructed buildings clinging to the Mule Mountains, but it represented her only hope. She had exactly $4.23 to her name, no family to speak of since her father's death 6 months prior, and a letter in her pocket that might be her salvation or her doom. The letter, creased and read so many times the ink was fading, was from Mrs. Dorothy Whitmore, proprietress of the Copper Queen boarding house, offering Rebecca a position as a cook and general helper. The position paid $8 a month with room and board, which was barely enough to survive on, but Rebecca had no other options. What terrified her most was not the present moment, but the future stretching before her like an endless desert. She was 22 years old, unmarried, and alone in a rough mining town where women were scarce and men were hungry for more than just her cooking. Her father had been a pharmacist in St. Louis, and his death from pneumonia had revealed debts she never knew existed. The creditors had taken everything, leaving her with nothing but her mother's silver locket and the clothes she could carry. The boarding house stood at the end of Brewery Gulch, a 3-story structure that leaned slightly to the left, as if tired from supporting the weight of too many transient miners. Rebecca clutched her bag tighter and started walking, aware of the stares from men loitering outside saloons and supply stores. Her dark green traveling dress was respectable but showed its age, and her auburn hair, pinned up as properly as she could manage after 3 days of travel, was coming loose in the dry wind. "You lost, pretty lady." A miner with gaps in his teeth blocked her path, his breath reeking of whiskey despite the early hour. "No, thank you. Please excuse me." Rebecca tried to step around him, but he matched her movement. Do not be unfriendly. A girl like you should not be walking alone, might get into trouble." The lady said, "Excuse her." The voice came from behind Rebecca, deep and quiet, but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. The miner's expression shifted from leering confidence to wary calculation in an instant. Rebecca turned to see a man who seemed carved from the mountains themselves. He stood well over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders straining against a worn flannel shirt, his dark hair long enough to brush his collar, and a beard that was neatly trimmed despite his otherwise rugged appearance. His eyes, a startling gray blue, met hers for a brief moment before returning to the miner. "I was just being friendly, Blake," the miner muttered, already backing away. "Be friendly somewhere else, Patterson." The big man, Blake apparently, waited until the miner shuffled off before turning his full attention to Rebecca. Up close, she could see the weathering of sun and wind on his face, the small scar above his left eyebrow, and the calluses on his hands that spoke of hard labor. He looked to be in his late 20s, perhaps 30 at most. "Thank you," Rebecca managed, suddenly aware of how inadequate the words were. "I was heading to the Copper Queen boarding house. Going or working?" His question was direct but not unkind. "Working. I am the new cook." "At least, I hope I still am. I was supposed to arrive yesterday, but the stage was delayed." Something that might have been sympathy flickered across his angular features. "Dorothy will not hold that against you. Stage delays are more common than punctuality around here. He gestured down the street. I will walk you there. Name is Blake Emerson. Rebecca Simmons. She fell into step beside him, having to take nearly 2 strides for every one of his. Do you work at the boarding house? No, madam. I am a trapper mostly. Sometimes I guide hunting parties or pack supplies into the mountains. I keep a room at the boarding house when I am in town, which is not often. He spoke with an economy of words that suggested he was more comfortable with silence than conversation. They walked past a general store where a woman in a calico dress swept the porch, past a blacksmith shop where the ring of hammer on anvil punctuated the air, past a saloon already doing brisk business despite the morning hour. Rebecca tried to memorize the layout of the town, this place that would be her home now, whether she wanted it or not. It is a rough town, Blake said, as if reading her thoughts. Mining towns usually are, but there are good people here too. Dorothy is one of them. She runs a respectable house. No drinking or gambling on the premises, and she does not tolerate men bothering her girls. Girls! Rebecca's stomach tightened. I thought I was to be the cook. You are, but Dorothy has 2 girls who help with the cleaning and laundry. She looks after them, makes sure they are safe. She will do the same for you. He paused at the foot of the boarding house steps. Word of advice, Miss Simmons. Do not go walking alone after dark, and do not accept drinks or gifts from the miners. Most of them are decent enough when sober, but copper fever makes men act foolish. Rebecca nodded, filing away this information along with a growing sense of dread about what her life was becoming. Blake tipped his hat and turned to leave, but she found herself calling after him. Mr. Emerson, will you be in town long? He turned back, those gray-blue eyes studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. A few days. Need to sell my furs and resupply before heading back into the mountains. I see. Well, thank you again for your kindness. No kindness about it, Miss Simmons. Just what any decent man would do. He walked away with long, measured strides, and Rebecca watched him go, wondering why she felt safer in the past 5 minutes than she had in the past 5 months. Dorothy Whitmore turned out to be a stout woman in her 50s with iron gray hair and shrewd blue eyes that seemed to assess Rebecca's entire history in a single glance. Her office was a small room off the kitchen, crammed with ledgers and correspondence, smelling of ink and coffee. You look exhausted, child, Dorothy said, gesturing for Rebecca to sit in the room's only spare chair. The stage delay was not your fault. I received word yesterday that there had been trouble with a broken wheel outside Tombstone. I am ready to start work immediately, Mrs. Whitmore. I do not want you to think I am not grateful for this opportunity. Call me Dorothy. Everyone does. And you will start work tomorrow after you have had a night's rest. I am not in the habit of working my girls to death. She poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on a small stove and handed one to Rebecca. Now, let us discuss your duties and accommodations. The position was as described in the letter. Cooking 3 meals a day for approximately 25 boarders, keeping the kitchen clean and organized, and helping with food purchasing and planning. Her room was on the 3rd floor, small but private, with a bed, a washstand, and a trunk for her belongings. Meals were included, and she would have Sunday afternoons off. The miners eat hearty and plenty, Dorothy explained. They work hard and they expect good food. Can you handle cooking for 25 men? Yes, madam. I mean, yes, Dorothy. I cooked for my father and took in boarders after my mother passed. At one point, we had 8 men staying with us. Dorothy nodded approvingly. That is good. You will meet the other girls at supper. Clara handles the laundry and mending, and Annie manages the cleaning. Both are good workers and will help you settle in. She paused, her expression softening slightly. Rebecca, I will be direct with you because I believe young women deserve honesty. This is not an easy life. The work is hard, the town is rough, and opportunities for women are limited. But I run a respectable establishment and I protect the people under my roof. You follow my rules, do your work, and you will be safe here. Do you understand? Yes, Dorothy, and I am grateful, truly. Good. Now let me show you to your room. You look ready to fall over. The room was indeed small, tucked under the eaves with a slanted ceiling that Blake Emerson would have to duck under, Rebecca thought, then wondered why he had come to mind. The bed was narrow, but the mattress seemed clean, and someone had placed a jar of wildflowers on the washstand. Through the single window, she could see the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks still holding snow despite the September heat. Rebecca unpacked her few belongings. 3 dresses, 2 nightgowns, undergarments, her mother's locket, a Bible, and a small wooden box containing recipes written in her mother's careful hand. Looking at the sparse contents of her life, she felt tears prick her eyes. This was all that remained of 22 years of living, of her father's pharmacy and her mother's garden and the life she had expected to lead. She sat on the bed, the enormity of her situation crashing over her like a wave. She was alone in a rough mining town, dependent on the charity of a woman she had just met, facing a future that offered nothing but hard work and uncertainty. What if she became ill? What if Dorothy's business failed? What if the mines played out and Bisbee became another ghost town? She had no safety, no family to fall back on, no prospect of anything better. The tears came then, hot and bitter, and she buried her face in her hands to muffle the sounds of her crying. She wept for her father, for her lost home, for the simple, secure life she had taken for granted until it was ripped away. But most of all, she wept from fear of the future, of the endless procession of days stretching ahead with no promise of anything but survival. A knock on the door startled her. She wiped her eyes hastily and called, "Come in." A young woman about Rebecca's age entered, carrying a pitcher of fresh water. She had blonde hair pinned in a simple bun and kind brown eyes that took in Rebecca's tear-stained face without judgment. "I am Clara," she said, setting the pitcher on the washstand. "I thought you might want to freshen up before supper. It is nothing fancy, just stew and biscuits, but Annie makes the best biscuits you have ever tasted." "Thank you." Rebecca's voice came out rough and she cleared her throat. "I am sorry. I must look a mess." Clara sat on the edge of the bed without invitation, a gesture that was both forward and comforting. "I cried for 3 days straight when I first came here. My husband died in a mining accident in Tombstone, and I had nowhere to go. Dorothy took me in, and I have been here 2 years now. I am sorry about your husband. Thank you. It gets easier, the loneliness. Having work helps, and Dorothy is good to us." Clara smiled. "And it is not all grim. There are church socials and dances, and some of the miners are actually quite nice when they are clean and sober. Annie is being courted by a nice fellow who works at the assay office." Rebecca managed a small smile in return. "That is good to hear. I confess, I am rather frightened of what comes next. We all are in our way, but you do not have to face it alone. You have us now." Clara stood and smoothed her skirts. "Supper is in an hour. Wear something you do not mind getting splashed on, as the miners are enthusiastic eaters and not always careful." After Clara left, Rebecca washed her face and changed into her plainest dress, a simple brown cotton that had seen better days. She pinned her hair more securely and studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. Her green eyes were red-rimmed but determined, and she lifted her chin slightly, trying to project a confidence she did not feel. The dining room was a long space dominated by three large tables set with simple white crockery and mismatched silverware. The room was already filling with miners, their faces freshly scrubbed, but their clothes still bearing the dust of their work. They talked loudly, their voices bouncing off the walls, and Rebecca felt a moment of panic at the sheer number of men. Dorothy appeared at her elbow. "Do not worry, they are harmless at mealtime. Food is all they care about. Come, I will introduce you." Dorothy rapped a wooden spoon against a pot, and the room fell silent. "Gentlemen, this is Miss Rebecca Simmons, our new cook. She will be starting tomorrow, so I expect you all to be on your best behavior and show her the same respect you show me." There was a chorus of greetings, and one man, older than the others with a shock of white hair, stood and bowed formally. "Welcome, Miss Simmons. We are very pleased to have you here. Dorothy is a fine woman, but her cooking could use some improvement." "That is enough out of you, Seamus O'Brien," Dorothy said, but she was smiling. "Sit down before I decide to burn your biscuits tomorrow." The meal was as Clara had promised, hearty stew with vegetables and thick biscuits that were indeed delicious. Rebecca sat at a smaller table near the kitchen with Dorothy, Clara, and Annie, a cheerful girl of about 19 with dark hair and dancing eyes. The conversation flowed around her, talk of the mines and the weather and the upcoming harvest dance, and gradually Rebecca felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Blake Emerson did not appear at supper, and Rebecca told herself she was not disappointed, merely curious about where the mountain man took his meals when in town. The next morning, Rebecca rose before dawn and made her way to the kitchen, a large room with 2 wood stoves, a massive work table, and shelves lined with supplies. Dorothy had left detailed notes about the boarders' preferences and schedules, and Rebecca set to work preparing breakfast. Coffee, oatmeal, bacon, eggs, and fresh bread that Clara had started the night before. She lost herself in the familiar rhythms of cooking, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. This was something she knew, something she could control in a world that had become bewilderingly uncertain. By the time the miners began filing in for breakfast, she had platters of food ready and fresh coffee brewing. The men ate with single-minded focus, shoveling food into their mouths between gulps of coffee, barely pausing for conversation. Rebecca kept the platters full, learning names and faces, noting who preferred their eggs fried hard and who loaded their coffee with sugar. Blake came in last, ducking through the doorway and taking a seat at the far end of one table. He ate more slowly than the miners, his movements deliberate, and when he met Rebecca's eyes across the room, he nodded once in acknowledgement. After breakfast, as she was washing dishes, Dorothy came into the kitchen. "You did well this morning." The men seemed pleased. "Thank you." It felt good to be working again. "Blake asked me to tell you that he is heading into the mountains this afternoon. Said to wish you well in your new position." Dorothy's eyes were shrewd. "He does not usually bother with pleasantries." Rebecca felt her cheeks warm. "He was kind to me yesterday, walking me here. I suppose he is just being neighborly." Blake Emerson does not do anything just to be neighborly. He is a good man, but he keeps to himself. Lost his family some years back, and he took it hard. Lives up in those mountains like a hermit most of the year. Dorothy patted Rebecca's shoulder. "But I am glad he was there yesterday when you needed help." The days fell into a pattern. Rebecca rose before dawn, prepared 3 meals, cleaned the kitchen, and fell into bed exhausted each night. The work was hard but satisfying, and the miners proved to be appreciative of her cooking, often complimenting her biscuits or asking for second helpings of her stew. Sunday afternoons became her treasured time, a few hours where she could walk through town, attend church services, or simply rest. Clara and Annie often invited her to join them for socials or walks, and gradually, Rebecca began to feel less like a stranger and more like a resident of Bisbee. But the fear of her future never entirely left her. At night, lying in her narrow bed, she would think about what would happen if she became ill or if Dorothy's business failed or if any of 100 disasters befell her. She had no savings, no family, no prospect of marriage to a man who could provide security. The miners treated her respectfully, seeing her as Dorothy's employee and therefore off-limits, but none of them were men she could imagine building a life with. September gave way to October, and the weather began to cool. Rebecca was kneading bread one morning when Dorothy came into the kitchen, her expression troubled. "There has been an accident at one of the mines. They are bringing injured men here because the doctor's office is full. I need you to help prepare the front parlor and gather clean cloths and hot water." Rebecca's hands stilled in the dough. "Of course. How many men?" "4, maybe 5. I do not have all the details yet." They worked quickly, moving furniture and covering the good carpet with oilcloth. Annie tore old sheets into bandages while Clara set water to boil. The injured miners arrived on makeshift stretchers, their faces gray with pain and shock, their clothes dark with blood and dirt. The doctor, a harried man named Stevens, worked with brisk efficiency, setting broken bones and stitching wounds. Rebecca assisted where she could, holding basins and bringing fresh water, trying not to flinch at the men's cries of pain. One man, younger than the others, gripped her hand tightly as the doctor cleaned a deep gash on his leg. "Am I going to lose it?" he asked, his voice high with fear. "The doctor will do everything he can," Rebecca said, though she had no idea if this was true. "What is your name?" "Charlie." "Charlie Brennan. I just started working here 2 months ago." "Well, Charlie, you are going to be fine. You are young and strong and you are in good hands." She kept talking to him, nonsense mostly, anything to keep him focused on her voice rather than the pain. When the doctor finished, and Charlie had been given laudanum for the pain, he squeezed her hand one more time. "Thank you, miss. You have a kind heart." The work continued into the evening, and it was nearly midnight before the last patient was settled and sleeping. Rebecca sat in the kitchen, her dress stained with blood, her hands shaking from exhaustion and the aftermath of adrenaline. Dorothy brought her a cup of tea. "You did well today. Not everyone can keep their head in a crisis. I just did what needed to be done. That is all any of us can do." Dorothy sat across from her, looking every one of her 50-plus years. "This is the reality of a mining town, Rebecca. The work is dangerous and accidents happen, but the people here, they take care of each other. You saw that today." Rebecca nodded, too tired for words. She finished her tea and dragged herself upstairs, where she stripped off her soiled dress and fell into bed without even washing her face. She dreamed of darkness and falling, of reaching for help and finding only empty air. The next morning she woke to find a package wrapped in brown paper outside her door. Inside was a new apron, sturdy white cotton with deep pockets, and a note in a strong, angular hand. "Heard about yesterday. Thought you might need this. Blake Emerson." Rebecca stared at the note, surprised and touched by the gesture. Blake had been gone for nearly a month, up in the mountains somewhere, yet he had heard about the mining accident and thought of her. She folded the apron carefully and wore it to the kitchen, where Dorothy raised her eyebrows but said nothing. Blake returned to town in early November, just as the first cold winds began sweeping down from the mountains. Rebecca was rolling out pie crust when he walked into the kitchen, and she felt an odd flutter in her chest at the sight of him. "Morning, Miss Simmons," he said, removing his hat. "Dorothy around?" She went to the dry goods store. She should be back shortly. Rebecca wiped her flour-dusted hands on the apron he had given her. "Thank you for this. It was very thoughtful." He shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Figured you could use it. Heard you helped with the injured miners." "I just did what anyone would have done." Most people find reasons not to help when there is blood involved. His gray-blue eyes studied her with that same intensity she remembered from their first meeting. "You settling in all right?" "Yes, thank you. Everyone has been very welcoming." An awkward silence fell between them, and Rebecca found herself searching for something to say, anything to keep him there a moment longer. "Will you be staying in town long this time?" "Few weeks, maybe. Winter is coming early this year. I can feel it in the air." He turned his hat in his hands. "I was wondering if you might like to take a walk on Sunday, if you have time off. There is a spot up in the hills with a good view of the valley. Thought you might enjoy seeing it before the snow comes." Rebecca's heart gave an unexpected leap. "I would like that very much." "I will come by after the midday meal then." He nodded once and left, and Rebecca stood in the kitchen with floury hands and a smile she could not quite suppress. Clara, who had been listening from the pantry, emerged with a knowing grin. "Blake Emerson just asked you walking." That is practically a declaration of love from a man like him. "Do not be ridiculous. He is just being friendly." "Blake is never just friendly. Trust me, this is significant." Clara helped herself to a piece of raw pie crust, earning a swat from Rebecca. "He is a good man, you know. Quiet and serious, but good. And handsome if you like the rugged mountain type. I hardly know him." "Then Sunday will be a good opportunity to learn more." Clara's expression turned serious. "But be careful, Rebecca. Mountain men are not like regular men. They are used to being alone, used to having things their own way. If you are looking for someone to settle down in town, Blake is probably not your man." Rebecca nodded, but her thoughts were already racing ahead to Sunday, to the prospect of spending an afternoon with the mysterious mountain man who had helped her on her first day in Bisbee. Sunday dawned clear and cold, with a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Rebecca dressed carefully in her best walking dress, a dark blue wool that brought out the green in her eyes, and pinned her hair up securely under a bonnet. She told herself she was not being vain, just practical, but she checked her reflection 3 times before going downstairs. Blake arrived exactly when he said he would, riding a large bay horse and leading a smaller chestnut mare. "Thought we would ride partway," he explained. "It is a fair distance on foot." Rebecca had not ridden in years, not since her father had sold their horses to pay debts, but she managed to mount the mare with only a little help from Blake. They rode out of town, following a trail that wound up into the hills, and Blake set an easy pace that allowed for conversation. "How long have you been trapping?" Rebecca asked. "About 8 years. Started right after I came to the territory." "Where are you from originally?" "Kansas. Had a farm there with my father and brother." His voice was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "Do you miss it?" Blake was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "I miss who I was then, but that life is gone and there is no use dwelling on what you cannot change." Rebecca understood that sentiment all too well. "I am sorry. I did not mean to pry." "You are not prying. It is just not something I talk about much." He glanced at her. "What about you? What brought you to Bisbee besides the obvious need for work?" "My father died and there were debts. The creditors took everything. Dorothy's advertisement for a cook seemed like providence." She paused, then added with more honesty than she had intended. "I was terrified when I arrived. I still am sometimes when I think about the future and how uncertain everything is. Fear is not a bad thing. It keeps you alert, keeps you from taking foolish risks. But what do you do when the fear becomes overwhelming? When you cannot see any path forward that does not lead to more uncertainty and danger?" Blake pulled his horse to a stop, and Rebecca did the same. They had reached a small plateau that overlooked the valley, and the view was breathtaking. Bisbee lay below them, small and insignificant against the vast sweep of mountains and sky. "I will tell you what I learned," Blake said, his voice low and serious. "The future is always uncertain. You can plan and work and save, and it can all disappear in a moment. I know that better than most. But you face it anyway, one day at a time, and you find people you can trust to face it with you. That is all any of us can do. And what if you do not have people? What if you are alone?" Blake dismounted and helped Rebecca down, his hands strong and steady on her waist. He did not step back immediately, and she found herself looking up into his weathered face, seeing the pain and loneliness that he tried to hide. "You are not alone, Rebecca. You have Dorothy and the girls. You have this town, rough as it is, and you have me if you want." He said it simply, as if offering her a cup of coffee rather than his companionship and protection. "I know I am not much. I live in the mountains most of the year, and I am not the easiest man to know. But I promise you this, if you will let me, I will face whatever comes next with you. You do not have to be afraid alone." Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes, moved by the raw honesty in his words. No pretty speeches, no false promises, just a simple offer of partnership from a man who understood loss and fear as well as she did. "Why?" she whispered. "Why me? You barely know me." Blake reached up and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "I knew the day I walked you to the boarding house. The way you held your head up even though you were scared, the way you thanked me for such a small kindness. You have courage, Rebecca Simmons, and a good heart. That is more than enough reason. I do not feel very courageous. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is moving forward despite it." He smiled then, a rare expression that transformed his stern features. "And you have been doing that since the moment you stepped off that stage." They stood there on the plateau, the wind whipping around them, and Rebecca felt something shift inside her chest. This rough, quiet man who lived in the mountains and spoke in careful sentences was offering her exactly what she needed. Someone to face the uncertain future with, someone who understood her fear and did not judge her for it. "I would like that," she said softly. "I would like to face things together." Blake's smile widened, and he took her hand in his palm warm and calloused against hers. "Then that is what we will do." They spent the afternoon on that plateau, talking in a way that felt both new and familiar. Blake told her about his trapping, about the mountains and the animals and the solitary life he led. Rebecca talked about her father, about her childhood in St. Louis, about the small, ordinary dreams she had once held. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, Blake helped her remount, and they rode back to town in comfortable silence. At the boarding house, he helped her dismount and held her hand a moment longer than necessary. "I will be in town for a few weeks," he said. "Would you mind if I called on you again? I would like that very much." "Good." He mounted his own horse and tipped his hat to her. "Good evening, Rebecca." She watched him ride away, her heart feeling lighter than it had in months. Inside, Clara and Annie were waiting, their faces eager with curiosity. "Well," Clara demanded. "How was it?" Rebecca smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "It was wonderful." Over the following weeks, Blake called on Rebecca regularly. He would arrive on Sunday afternoons, and they would walk through town or ride out into the hills, always returning before dark as propriety demanded. He brought her small gifts, a perfect hawk feather, a smooth stone from a mountain stream, a bundle of sage that made the kitchen smell like the wild places he called home. They talked about everything and nothing, gradually learning each other's histories and hopes. Blake told her about his family's farm in Kansas, about how a drought and debts had forced them to sell. His father had died of a heart attack during the ordeal, and his mother and brother had moved back east to live with relatives. Blake, unable to bear farming anymore, had come west seeking something he could not quite name. "I found peace in the mountains," he said one Sunday as they sat on a bench outside the church. "Up there, things make sense. There is no pretense, no false promises, just survival and beauty and silence." "But do you not get lonely?" Blake looked at her, his gray-blue eyes serious. "I was lonely for a long time. Then I met you, and I realized that what I was really doing was hiding. Hiding from the pain of losing everything, hiding from the risk of caring about anything that could be taken away." He took her hand. "You make me want to stop hiding." Rebecca squeezed his hand, understanding exactly what he meant. "I feel the same way. I have been so focused on just surviving that I forgot about actually living. Then maybe we can help each other remember." In December, the first snow came, dusting the mountains and making the streets of Bisbee muddy with slush. Blake helped Dorothy with repairs around the boarding house, fixing a loose step and replacing a broken window. The miners watched with interest, and Seamus O'Brien pulled Rebecca aside one evening. "That Blake is a good man," he said, his Irish accent thick with approval. "Quiet and strange, maybe, but good. If you are thinking of settling with him, you could do far worse." "We are just walking out together," Rebecca protested, though her cheeks flushed with pleasure. "Ah, but a man like Blake does not court a woman unless he is serious about it. Mark my words, lass, you will be married before spring." The idea should have terrified her, but instead Rebecca found herself hoping Seamus was right. She had grown to care deeply for Blake, for his quiet strength and unexpected gentleness, for the way he listened to her fears without trying to dismiss them. When she was with him, the future seemed less frightening, less like a vast unknown and more like an adventure they would face together. On Christmas Eve, Blake arrived at the boarding house with a package wrapped in cloth. Dorothy had organized a small celebration for the boarders, with a decorated tree and a special meal, and the parlor was full of people singing carols and exchanging small gifts. Blake drew Rebecca aside to a quiet corner and handed her the package. Inside was a beautiful shawl, woven from soft wool in shades of blue and green. "I traded for it at the Apache village up in the mountains," Blake explained. "The woman who made it is famous for her work. I thought the colors matched your eyes." Rebecca wrapped the shawl around her shoulders, touched by his thoughtfulness. "It is beautiful, Blake. Thank you." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her own gift, a new pair of leather gloves she had purchased with her carefully saved wages. "I know your old ones are worn through." Blake pulled on the gloves, flexing his fingers and nodding with approval. "They fit perfectly. Thank you, Rebecca." They stood there together, watching the celebration swirl around them, and Blake leaned down to speak quietly in her ear. "I have something else to give you, but I want to wait for the right moment." "What is it?" "You will see. Soon." He smiled at her, and Rebecca felt her heart skip. The right moment came 2 weeks later on a clear January afternoon. Blake had asked Rebecca to ride out with him, and they had returned to the plateau where he had first spoken about facing the future together. The valley below was white with snow, and the air was so cold that their breath made clouds. Blake dismounted and helped Rebecca down, then led her to the edge of the plateau where they could see for miles in every direction. He took both her hands in his expression serious but his eyes warm. "Rebecca, I am not good with fancy words or romantic speeches. I am just a mountain man who lives rough and works hard, but I love you. I have loved you since that first day when you walked through Bisbee with your head held high even though you were scared half to death." He paused, searching her face. "I know I cannot offer you an easy life or a fine house in town, but I can offer you my heart and my loyalty and my promise to face whatever comes next together. Will you marry me?" Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears, tears of relief and joy and love. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, Blake, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close against the cold, and Rebecca felt the fear that had plagued her for so long begin to dissolve. She was choosing this, choosing him, choosing a future that was uncertain but no longer terrifying because she would not face it alone. Blake kissed her then, a gentle, reverent kiss that tasted of coffee and promises. When they pulled apart, he reached into his coat pocket and produced a simple gold band. "It was my mother's," he said, slipping it onto Rebecca's finger. "She gave it to me before I left Kansas, told me to save it for the right woman. I think she would have loved you." Rebecca looked down at the ring, her heart full to bursting. "When?" she asked. "As soon as you are ready. Tomorrow if you want, or next month, whenever you say." "Spring," Rebecca decided. "I want to marry you in the spring when everything is new and growing. Spring it is." Blake kissed her again, and they stood together on that plateau, two people who had lost everything finding everything they needed in each other. The news of their engagement spread through the boarding house and then through the town. Dorothy was delighted. Clara and Annie declared themselves in charge of planning the wedding, and the miners toasted Blake's good fortune with such enthusiasm that Dorothy had to remind them several times about her no-drinking policy. Rebecca wrote to Blake's mother, a careful letter introducing herself and asking for her blessing. The response came 6 weeks later, a warm letter welcoming Rebecca to the family and expressing happiness that Blake had found someone to share his life. As winter gave way to spring, Rebecca and Blake made plans for their future. Blake had a cabin in the mountains, a sturdy structure he had built himself near a stream that ran year-round. They would live there during the trapping season, and Blake would teach Rebecca the skills she needed to survive in the wilderness. In the summer, they would come down to Bisbee, where Blake would work as a guide and Rebecca would help Dorothy at the boarding house. It was not the life Rebecca had imagined for herself growing up in St. Louis, but it was a good life, one built on honest work and real partnership. And when doubt crept in during the night, when she worried about the hardships of mountain living or the isolation, she would remember Blake's promise. They would face it together. The wedding took place on a warm April morning in the small church at the end of Brewery Gulch. Rebecca wore a new dress that Clara and Annie had helped her sew, a simple cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. Blake wore a new suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, though he had grumbled about the tie. Dorothy cried through the entire ceremony, and Seamus O'Brien served as Blake's witness. The Reverend, a kind man named Pastor Williams, spoke about the importance of partnership and faith, and when Blake slipped a second ring onto Rebecca's finger, his hands were steady and sure. "I promise to love you and protect you, to face whatever comes next together, for as long as we both shall live," Blake said, his voice low but clear. Rebecca's own voice was thick with emotion as she made her vows. "I promise to love you and stand with you, to be your partner in all things, for as long as we both shall live." When Pastor Williams pronounced them married, Blake kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak, and the small gathering of guests erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration continued at the boarding house, where Dorothy had prepared a feast and the parlor had been decorated with spring flowers. Rebecca and Blake cut a cake that Annie had baked, danced to music played on Seamus's fiddle, and accepted the good wishes of their friends and neighbors. As the sun began to set, Blake pulled Rebecca aside. "Ready to see your new home, Mrs. Emerson?" Rebecca smiled at the sound of her new name. "More than ready." They rode out of Bisbee as the stars began to appear, heading into the mountains that would be their home. Rebecca carried a bundle of her belongings and wore Blake's mother's ring on her finger. And for the first time since her father's death, she felt truly hopeful about the future. The cabin was a day's ride from Bisbee, nestled in a small valley surrounded by pine trees. It was larger than Rebecca had expected, with a main room that served as kitchen and living space, a separate bedroom, and a covered porch that looked out over the stream. Blake had spent the past month making improvements, adding shelves and a proper bed frame, making the space ready for his bride. "It is not fancy," Blake said, watching Rebecca explore, "but it is solid and warm, and the location is good for trapping." "It is perfect," Rebecca said, and she meant it. The cabin was rough but clean, filled with the scent of pine and wood smoke, and through the window she could see mountains rising against the darkening sky. This was her home now, hers and Blake's, a place they would build their life together. That night, lying in Blake's arms in the bed he had made for them, Rebecca thought about how far she had come from the terrified young woman who had stepped off the stage in Bisbee 7 months ago. She had been so afraid of her future, so certain that she faced it alone. But Blake had shown her a different path, one where fear was acknowledged but not allowed to control, where partnership made even the hardest challenges bearable. "What are you thinking about?" Blake asked, his voice rumbling in his chest beneath her ear. "About how grateful I am," Rebecca said. "About how lucky I am to have found you." Blake tightened his arms around her. "I am the lucky one. You could have chosen safety, could have found some merchant in town to marry. Instead, you chose a rough mountain man and a hard life." "I chose love," Rebecca corrected. "I chose partnership and honesty and someone who understands what it means to be afraid but brave anyway. That is not a hard life, Blake. That is the best life I could imagine." He kissed the top of her head. "Then I will do everything in my power to make sure you never regret that choice." "I know you will." The first months of marriage were an adjustment. Rebecca had to learn how to cook on an open hearth, how to preserve food for the long winters, how to identify the plants that were safe to eat and the ones that were poisonous. Blake taught her to shoot, patiently correcting her stance until she could hit a target with reasonable accuracy. He showed her how to read the weather in the clouds and the behavior of animals, how to find water in dry country, how to stay calm when a bear wandered too close to the cabin. It was hard work, harder than anything Rebecca had done at the boarding house, but it was satisfying in a way that surprised her. Each new skill she learned made her more confident, more capable, more certain that she could survive whatever challenges the mountain threw at her. Blake was a patient teacher and a considerate husband. He respected her fears without coddling her, pushed her to grow without expecting too much too soon. At night, they would sit on the porch and Blake would point out constellations, or they would read aloud from the few books they owned, or they would simply talk about their days and their plans for the future. In June, they made the journey down to Bisbee, their pack horses loaded with the furs Blake had trapped over the winter. The town seemed smaller and noisier than Rebecca remembered, but she was happy to see Dorothy and the girls. "Look at you," Dorothy said, studying Rebecca with approval. "Mountain life agrees with you. You look healthy and strong." It was true. Rebecca's face had tanned despite her bonnet, and her arms had grown stronger from hauling water and wood. She moved with a new confidence, no longer the frightened girl who had arrived on the stage, but a woman who knew her own capabilities. They spent 2 weeks in Bisbee, while Blake sold his furs and purchased supplies. Rebecca helped Dorothy at the boarding house, delighting the miners with her cooking and catching up on all the town gossip. Annie was now formally engaged to her young man from the assay office, and Clara had received a letter from a cousin in California inviting her to visit. "Things change," Dorothy said one evening as she and Rebecca sat on the boarding house porch. "People move on, start new lives. It makes me happy to see, even if I will miss them." "You will always have people who need you," Rebecca assured her. "This town could not function without you." "Maybe so. But it is good to know that the people I help do not need me forever, that they can go on to build their own lives." Dorothy patted Rebecca's hand. "I am proud of you, you know. You came here so afraid, and look at you now, happy and settled and strong." "I had good help," Rebecca said. "From you and from Blake. You did the work yourself, child. We just gave you a place to do it." When they returned to the mountains in July, Rebecca felt the rightness of it, the sense of coming home. She had loved living at the boarding house, but the cabin in the valley was where she truly belonged, where she and Blake were building something that was entirely their own. In September, Rebecca began to suspect she was pregnant. She waited until she was certain before telling Blake, choosing a quiet evening when they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "I have something to tell you," she said, taking his hand. "We are going to have a baby, sometime in the spring, I think." Blake's face went through a series of expressions: shock, joy, fear, and finally settling on a fierce protectiveness. "Are you all right? Do you feel well? Should we go to Bisbee so the doctor can examine you?" Rebecca laughed at his concern. "I am fine, Blake. Women have been having babies for thousands of years. But yes, I think we should plan to be in Bisbee when my time comes. I would feel better having the doctor and Dorothy nearby. We will go whenever you say, and I will take care of everything. You should not be working so hard if you are carrying our child. I am pregnant, not ill. I can still work." But she was touched by his worry, by the way he immediately began planning and organizing to ensure her safety. Over the following months, as Rebecca's belly grew round with their child, Blake became even more attentive. He took over the heavier chores without being asked, made sure she had the best food and warmest blankets, and treated her as if she were made of glass. "Blake, I love you, but you need to stop hovering," Rebecca said one December morning when he tried to prevent her from carrying a bucket of water. "I am perfectly capable of carrying water. But what if you slip on the ice? What if you fall and hurt yourself or the baby? Then I will be more careful, but you cannot wrap me in cotton wool for the next 3 months. I will go crazy." Blake sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I am sorry, I just worry. After losing my family, after knowing how quickly things can go wrong, I cannot bear the thought of anything happening to you." Rebecca set down the bucket and wrapped her arms around him, as far as they would reach around his broad frame. "I know you are scared. I am scared too. But we have to trust that things will be all right, that we are strong enough to handle whatever comes. Together, remember." Blake held her close, his face buried in her hair. "Together," he agreed. In February, when Rebecca was nearly 8 months along, they made the journey to Bisbee. The trip took longer than usual, with Blake insisting on frequent stops and a slow pace to avoid jostling Rebecca. They took a room at the boarding house, and Dorothy fussed over Rebecca like a mother hen. "You look wonderful," Dorothy declared. "Blooming, as they say. Have you chosen names?" "Benjamin if it is a boy," Rebecca said, "after Blake's father, and Rose if it is a girl, after my mother. Both lovely names. And you are planning to return to the mountains after the baby comes?" "Once I am strong enough to travel, yes. The cabin is our home. But we will visit often, and when the baby is older, perhaps we will spend more time in town so the child can go to school." "Well, you are always welcome here. You know that." Rebecca's labor began on a warm night in early April, nearly a year to the day after her wedding. Blake paced the hallway outside the bedroom, his face pale with worry, while Dr. Stevens and Dorothy attended to Rebecca. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Rebecca focused on breathing, on pushing when told to push, on the fact that women had been doing this since the beginning of time. When the pain became overwhelming, she thought of Blake's promise. They would face everything together. He was just outside the door waiting for her, ready to face this next chapter of their lives. Finally, as the sun began to set on the second day, Rebecca heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby's first cry. "It is a boy," Dr. Stevens announced, placing the squalling infant on Rebecca's chest. "A healthy, strong boy." Rebecca looked down at her son, at his red, wrinkled face and shock of dark hair, and felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. "Benjamin," she whispered. "Hello, Benjamin." The door burst open and Blake rushed in, his eyes wild with worry and hope. "Rebecca, are you all right?" "I am fine. Come meet your son." Blake approached the bed slowly, reverently, and looked down at the tiny baby in Rebecca's arms. His expression was one of wonder and terror and overwhelming love. "He is perfect," Blake said, his voice choked with emotion. "You are perfect. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for this gift." Rebecca reached out and took Blake's hand, placing it on their son's small back. "We made him together. He is our future, Blake. The future we were both so afraid of, and look how beautiful it is." Blake leaned down and kissed her, gentle and loving, and then brushed a finger over Benjamin's soft cheek. "I promise to protect you both with everything I have. I know you will. But you do not have to do it alone. We are a family now, and we face everything together." The early weeks with Benjamin were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Rebecca learned to nurse and change and soothe, while Blake hovered anxiously, ready to help however he could. Dorothy and the girls took turns bringing meals and helping with laundry, and the miners collectively decided that Benjamin was the finest baby ever born in Bisbee. When Benjamin was 6 weeks old, Rebecca declared herself ready to return to the mountains. Blake was hesitant, worried about the journey with such a young infant, but Rebecca insisted. "The cabin is our home," she said firmly. "Benjamin should grow up there, learning about the mountains and the wilderness. He will be fine, Blake. Children are tougher than you think." So they made the journey carefully, with Benjamin tucked securely in a sling against Rebecca's chest. He slept through most of the trip, waking only to nurse, and by the time they reached the cabin, Rebecca was confident in her decision. Life in the mountains with a baby was different but still good. Rebecca learned to work with Benjamin strapped to her back or napping in a cradle Blake had carved. Blake adjusted his trapping schedule, so he was never gone for more than a day at a time, unwilling to leave Rebecca and his son alone for longer. As Benjamin grew, he became the perfect blend of both his parents. He had Blake's gray-blue eyes and Rebecca's auburn hair, Blake's quiet intensity and Rebecca's warm heart. He took his first steps on the cabin porch, spoke his first word watching his father work, and grew strong and healthy in the clean mountain air. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and work and love. Rebecca and Blake made their annual trips to Bisbee, watching the town grow and change. Dorothy eventually retired and sold the boarding house, though she continued to live in Bisbee and dote on Benjamin whenever they visited. Clara married a rancher and moved to New Mexico, while Annie and her husband took over the assay office. When Benjamin was 3, Rebecca discovered she was pregnant again. This time she was less frightened, more confident in her body's ability to bring a child into the world. Their daughter Rose was born in Bisbee during another spring visit, and Blake cried when he held her for the first time. "Two perfect children," he said, looking between his daughter and his son. "How did I get so lucky?" "We both got lucky," Rebecca corrected, watching Benjamin gently touch his sister's tiny hand. "We found each other when we needed it most." Rose proved to be as different from Benjamin as night from day. Where he was quiet and serious, she was boisterous and laughing. Where he preferred solitary pursuits, she demanded constant attention and playmates. But they adored each other, and watching them grow together filled Rebecca's heart with joy. As the children grew older, Blake and Rebecca began spending more time in Bisbee during the school months, so Benjamin and Rose could receive proper education. Blake worked as a guide and hunter, his reputation for skill and honesty making him much in demand. Rebecca helped at the new boarding house that had opened after Dorothy sold hers, teaching the young cook and occasionally preparing special meals for events. But they always returned to the cabin for summers and holidays, teaching their children the skills they would need to survive in the wilderness. Benjamin grew into a tall, serious young man who loved the mountains as much as his father did. Rose, despite her social nature, proved to be an excellent tracker and shot. One evening when Benjamin was 15 and Rose was 12, the family sat on the cabin porch watching the sunset. Blake had his arm around Rebecca, who leaned comfortably against his shoulder, while the children sprawled on the steps arguing companionably about something Rebecca was not quite following. "You remember when we met?" Blake asked quietly, so only Rebecca could hear. "Every detail. You saved me from that drunk miner, walked me to the boarding house, and told me I was brave when I did not feel brave at all. You were terrified of your future, and you promised we would face it together." Rebecca smiled up at him. "Best promise anyone ever made me." Blake kissed her temple. "I did not know then that our future would be so beautiful. 2 wonderful children, a good life, work we believe in. I thought I was offering you hardship and uncertainty. You offered me partnership and love. The rest we built together." Rebecca watched their children, so healthy and happy and secure, and felt a deep contentment. "I am not afraid anymore, you know, of the future, I mean. Whatever comes, I know we will face it together." "Always," Blake agreed. "Always together." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Rebecca thought about the terrified young woman she had been, stepping off that stage in Bisbee with nothing but fear and desperation. She thought about Blake, the quiet mountain man who had seen something worth saving in her, who had offered her exactly what she needed when she needed it most. Their life had not been easy. There had been hard winters and sick children, years when the trapping was poor and money was tight, moments of fear and doubt and exhaustion. But through it all, they had faced everything together. 2 people who understood that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to move forward despite it. And now, surrounded by her family in the mountains she had come to love, Rebecca felt nothing but gratitude for every choice that had led her to this moment. She had been so afraid of her future, but that future had turned out to be more wonderful than anything she could have imagined. Blake squeezed her shoulder, and Rebecca squeezed back, a wordless communication that needed no explanation. They had promised to face the future together, and they had kept that promise every single day since. And they would continue to keep it, through whatever joys and sorrows the years ahead might bring, because that was what love meant. Showing up, day after day, and facing life together. As full darkness fell and the children finally came inside, Rebecca took one last look at the mountains silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but she was not afraid. She had everything she needed: a partner who loved her, children who made her proud, and a life built on honesty and hard work and the simple, profound decision to face the future together. And that, Rebecca thought as she followed her family inside, was more than enough.